Secretary of Defense slaps a female soldier in court. Seconds later, she took the witness seat. That single moment shook the courtroom, leaving everyone frozen between disbelief and outrage. What began as another routine trial for the most powerful man in the military spiraled into a public spectacle no one could have predicted. He thought he could humiliate her, silence her with a gesture of raw authority. But within seconds, the entire balance of power shifted, and the woman he tried to break became the one voice that could destroy him. Her silence after the slap wasn't weakness. It was strategy. She wasn't just a soldier sitting in the gallery. She was a witness holding secrets that could dismantle an empire. And as she walked toward the stand, the arrogance that filled the room began to crumble. Every soldier, every journalist, every spectator realized they weren't just watching a trial. They were witnessing history. If you believe stories of courage like this deserve to be told, make sure to subscribe, like, and leave your comment below. Your support ensures more revelations come to light. Now, let's step into that courtroom, where silence became defiance, and defiance became justice. The courtroom was already thick with tension long before the Secretary of Defense arrived. Journalists filled the back rows, their pens ready. Cameras hidden under coats to avoid the bailiff's sharp eye. Soldiers in uniform lined the benches, some leaning forward with the unease of men who knew that today's proceedings were more than a trial. They were a spectacle of power. At the center of it all, the tall mahogany chair of a presiding judge loomed over the room like a throne, reminding everyone that justice here was supposed to be blind. Yet whispers hinted otherwise. When Richard Harlow, the Secretary of Defense, entered, the air shifted. His polished shoes clicked against a marble floor with the rhythm of someone used to commanding entire armies. The crowd stood instinctively, though no one had ordered it. His medals gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights, and he lifted his chin with the arrogance of a man who believed the room itself belonged to him. "Let's get this done quickly," he muttered, his voice carrying enough weight to silence even the reporter's whispers. The judge glanced at him sternly, but Harlow ignored it, already settling into a seat with the confidence of untouchable authority. In the second row sat Captain Elena Ramirez, posture rigid, hands resting on her knees. She wore her service uniform neatly, but without adornment, the green fabric emphasizing both her discipline and her humility. Her presence barely registered to the crowd. To them, she was just another soldier caught in the gravity of a man who commanded nations. Yet Elena's eyes, steady and unblinking, hinted at something hidden, a determination not yet revealed. If anyone had looked closely, they might have seen the flicker of defiance buried beneath her calm. The bailiff announced the charges, his monotone voice describing acts of corruption and abuse of power. Yet Harlow sat unmoved, his lips twitching in what might have been amusement. He drummed his fingers on the armrest, each tap echoing in the still room. "Baseless accusations," he whispered to the aide beside him. But his eyes scanned the audience with suspicion, as though searching for an enemy hiding in plain sight. Elena noticed. For a brief second, their gazes locked, and though he looked away quickly, something in his jaw tightened. Judge McKenna entered with deliberate steps, his black robe swaying like a curtain pulled before a drama. "This court is now in session," he declared, his voice steady, trying to assert authority in a room already dominated by the secretary's presence. Elena inhaled deeply, her lungs filling with the dry air of the courtroom. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, but no rehearsal could capture the gravity of being here now, within sight of the man who had once determined her fate. The prosecution began with formalities, presenting evidence, questioning minor witnesses, building what seemed to be a slow, deliberate case. Harlow leaned back, bored, occasionally smirking when testimony brushed against his reputation. Every reaction from him was calculated arrogance, a performance of the cameras he knew were waiting outside. "They'll never touch me," he thought. "Not here, not today." Yet across the room, Elena's steady silence contradicted his certainty. She didn't look like someone defeated. She looked like someone waiting. As the hours dragged on, the tension thickened rather than eased. The secretary whispered to his attorney, laughter slipping past his lips as though mocking the entire process. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the imbalance of power. Still, Elena remained composed, her hands folded neatly, her gaze never wavering from a man who had humiliated countless others. She was the only one who didn't shrink before his authority, and though no one noticed yet, that alone set her apart. Then came the first spark. During a heated exchange with the prosecution, Harlow snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "This is a waste of the nation's time," he shouted, his voice reverberating like gunfire. The judge ordered him to calm down, but his defiance was a spectacle in itself. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and for the first time, the press scribbled frantically, sensing a story more volatile than expected. Elena's lips tightened, but she didn't move. Not yet. The silence after his outburst was the kind that hinted something irreversible had been set in motion. When the court recessed for a brief break, whispers filled every corner of the chamber. Some spoke of the secretary's arrogance. Others speculated about the prosecution's strategy. Elena remained seated, her eyes fixed forward. She knew the storm had only just begun. For the others, this was still a trial of law and reputation. For her, it was something deeper, something personal. And though no one else realized it yet, she was not just a spectator here. She was a fuse waiting to be lit. The session resumed, and the air grew heavier as Richard Harlow returned to his seat with a smirk carved across his face. His hand rested confidently on the table, as though he were still commanding a war room rather than answering charges in courtroom. The prosecution called a young officer to testify about irregular orders, but Harlow interrupted mid-sentence. "Nonsense. This boy doesn't even understand the chain of command," he scoffed, his voice booming. The judge struck his gavel, warning him, but the room had already shifted. His dominance was on display, and his arrogance was palpable. Elena watched closely, her pulse steady despite the storm brewing. The officer stumbled, intimidated, and Harlow seized a moment to sneer. "If this is the best you have, you should all be ashamed," he declared. Laughter echoed faintly from a few uniformed supporters in the back rows. It was theater, and Harlow loved the stage. Yet for all his bravado, Elena could see a flicker of unease. His eyes darted quickly to the folder in her lap before turning to his mocking grin. She tightened her grip on it, knowing that sooner or later the weight of its contents would crush him. But not yet, she thought. The timing had to be perfect. As the testimony collapsed under Harlow's intimidation, the prosecutor clenched her jaw, whispering heatedly to her aide. Judge McKenna rubbed his temple, visibly irritated. "Order, Mr. Harlow," he commanded. But Richard leaned back and shrugged. "You can't order authority," he quipped, drawing muffled gasps. The imbalance of power was suffocating. Every word from him carried more force than the evidence presented. Elena inhaled deeply, her chest rising as though bracing for impact. She was no longer just observing. She was calculating. Then the moment of humiliation came. As the court grew restless, Elena shifted slightly, catching Harlow's eye. His lips curled into a cruel smile. "And here we are," he said loudly, pointing toward her, "dragging in children who think wearing a uniform makes them worthy of respect." The words cut, but Elena didn't flinch. The room fell silent. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see her crumble. Instead, she sat taller, meeting his stare with unyielding calm. That only fueled his rage. He rose abruptly, crossed a short distance, and before anyone could intervene, his hand struck her cheek with a sharp crack that echoed like a rifle shot. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Reporters scrambled, pens scratching furiously, cameras clicking despite the bailiff's shouts. Judge McKenna slammed his gavel, his voice shaking with fury. "Order! Order in this court." But the damage was done. Elena's face burned, yet she kept her gaze fixed forward. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her recoil. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Everyone expected her to collapse, to shout, to retaliate. Instead, she remained motionless, her hand slowly lifting to her cheek, her eyes narrow with resolve that unsettled even her attacker. Harlow returned to his seat with the arrogance of a man convinced he had reinforced his superiority. "That's discipline," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for half the room to hear. His attorney buried his face in his hands, realizing the spectacle had gone too far. Elena exhaled through her nose, steady and controlled, her jaw tightening. She wasn't broken. If anything, She looked stronger, her silence heavier than any outburst could have been. And in that silence, a question began to ripple through the room. Why isn't she reacting? Reporters leaned forward, sensing the story was no longer about dry accusations of corruption. It had become a battle of humiliation and defiance, man versus woman, power versus principle. The prosecutor glanced at Elena, reading something in her posture, something unshaken. A quiet fire that hinted at retribution, not yet revealed. She's waiting, Sarah Whitmore thought, scribbling a note for her team. But for what? Even Judge McKenna, though furious at Harlow's behavior, could not help but notice the soldier's composure. It was as though she carried a weapon no one else could see. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, some horrified, others fascinated. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, torn between loyalty to the secretary and admiration for the young captain who had just endured his wrath without faltering. Elena lowered her hand from her cheek and folded it neatly in her lap, eyes locked on Harlow with quiet intensity. She had been struck in front of everyone. But the real blow had yet to come, and it would not be hers to bear. The mini cliffhanger hung heavy in the air. What does she know that makes her so calm? The echo of the slap still lingered when Judge McKenna raised his gavel again, his voice trembling with restrained fury. "This court will have order," he barked. His eyes flicked toward Elena, as if expecting her protest, but she sat perfectly still. The silence that followed only deepened the unease. Then the prosecutor rose, papers in hand. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Captain Elena Ramirez to stand." The words cut through the room like a blade. Murmurs erupted instantly. Harlow's head snapped toward her, disbelief etched across his face. "What?" he spat, his confidence shaken for the first time. Elena rose slowly, her boots clicking against the marble floor as she walked toward the witness seat. Every step was deliberate, each one a silent declaration that she was no longer just a passive target. The audience leaned forward, straining to see the soldier who had endured humiliation without breaking. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, her shoulders square. If her cheek still burned, she didn't show it. Harlow chuckled bitterly. "This is a circus," he sneered. What could she possibly know? His laughter was hollow, failing to mask the tightening of his jaw. Judge McKenna gestured toward the chair, his tone firm. "Captain Ramirez, you may take the stand." Elena lowered herself into the witness seat, back straight, hands folded neatly. The courtroom buzzed, half in disbelief, half in anticipation. Reporters scribbled frantically, already sensing this testimony could shift the entire trial. For a moment, the secretary's authority seemed to falter. Elena's presence there, calm, unwavering, felt like a storm on the horizon, a storm only she controlled. The judge nodded. "Proceed." The prosecutor adjusted her glasses, locking eyes with Elena. "Captain, for the record, please state your position and service history." Elena's voice was steady, resonant. "Captain Elena Ramirez, 10 years of service, including deployment in classified operations under direct command of Secretary Richard Harlow." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Harlow stiffened, his smirk vanishing. For the first time, the audience realized this was no ordinary witness. She had been on the inside. She had seen what others hadn't. And now, she was about to speak. Harlow shot up from his chair, slamming a fist against the table. "This is outrageous," he roared. "She has no standing here. She's a pawn, nothing more." His attorney tugged at his sleeve, whispering frantically, but the secretary's fury drowned out reason. Judge McKenna leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Sit down, Mr. Harlow, or I will hold you in contempt." The authority in the judge's tone cracked the illusion that Richard commanded this room. For once, he obeyed, lowering himself back into his seat with a glare that could have burned through steel. Elena did not flinch at his rage. She opened a small folder on her lap, its contents hidden for now, but the mere sight of it caused a ripple of anxiety through the courtroom. Harlow's eyes darted to it, his lips tightening as though recognizing a threat. She met his stare, unblinking, her silence louder than any words. "Captain Ramirez," the prosecutor said, her voice calm but edged with anticipation. "Were you present during the operations that fall under this investigation?" Elena inhaled slowly. Yes, she answered, her tone slicing through the air like a blade. The audience shifted uneasily, realizing the dynamics of the trial had transformed. The woman who had been struck in public was no longer a victim. She was a witness of devastating relevance. Journalists scribbled headlines in their notebooks. The soldier who defied the secretary. The soldiers in the gallery exchanged uneasy glances, some filled with admiration, others with fear of what might be exposed. In the silence that followed, even the hum of the lights seemed amplified, as though the entire room held its breath. For Harlow, the humiliation of slapping her now became more than a public spectacle. It was a prelude to his unraveling. He clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Elena, meanwhile, sat with an unshakable calm, the embodiment of discipline forged through years of service. She had waited for this exact moment, endured humiliation for this precise turn. And now, the courtroom was about to discover why. Mini cliffhanger. What truths would her testimony reveal that could shake the secretary's fortress of power? Elena adjusted the microphone, her voice carrying with the calm authority of a soldier who had nothing left to fear. I served under Secretary Harlow during Operation Iron Shield, she began. An operation presented to the public as a defensive maneuver. But the truth is, it was used to funnel resources into private contracts and silence dissent within the ranks. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The prosecutor leaned in, urging her on. Richard Harlow's lips twisted into a forced smile. Lies, he muttered, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed unease. The prosecutor handed Elena a document from her folder. She held it high enough for the judge to see. This is a direct order signed by the secretary, she explained. It contradicts the official reports released to the press. The judge studied it briefly before nodding grimly. Harlow slammed his hand on the table. That paper means nothing. It could be fabricated, he barked. His attorney whispered furiously, but Harlow shoved him aside, his fury uncontained. The courtroom murmured, sensing the secretary's control slipping through his fingers. Elena's gaze never wavered. I was there when the order was given, she said firmly. I saw the consequences. Soldiers were forced into missions with no backup, while contractors loyal to Harlow profited. And when we questioned it, we were silenced. Her voice cracked slightly, but it was not weakness. It was raw memory. The audience leaned closer, caught between horror and fascination. Harlow's knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrest. His silence in that moment spoke louder than his rage. Trying to regain control, Harlow laughed harshly. A disgruntled officer seeking attention. That's all this is, he sneered. She's nothing but a minor cog in the machine, bitter she wasn't promoted. His words cut through the air, sharp and dismissive, but his eyes betrayed panic. Elena leaned forward. If I were a minor cog, then why are you so afraid of what I'll say next? The jab landed like a strike, drawing gasps in the gallery. For the first time, the secretary's arrogance faltered visibly. Judge McKenna raised his hand. Captain Ramirez, can you confirm the authenticity of these documents under oath? Elena met his eyes with steady resolve. Yes, Your Honor. I will swear on everything I have served to protect. The weight of her words pressed against the silence that followed. Reporters scribbled furiously, headlines already forming in their minds. For years, whispers of corruption had circulated, but never had anyone dared to speak them aloud in the courtroom, under oath, in front of the man accused himself. The prosecutor revealed another sheet, this one containing financial records. These transactions trace funds directly from the Department of Defense budget to companies linked to Harlow's associates. Elena nodded. I was ordered to oversee some of these shipments. I saw crates marked for military use diverted to private airfields. Harlow leapt from his seat again. Enough, he roared. This entire trial is a farce. The judge slammed his gavel, his voice cutting through chaos. Sit down, secretary, or face contempt. The command stung, a reminder that his authority wasn't absolute here. Elena's calm stood in stark contrast to his unraveling. She turned back to the prosecutor. I can provide coordinates, dates, and personnel involved, she said steadily. The courtroom fell silent again, the gravity of her testimony sinking in. Soldiers in the audience shifted uncomfortably, some realizing their own names might be among those listed. Harlow's attorney tugged at his sleeve, begging him to stop reacting, but Richard's pride would not allow silence. His face reddened, his voice cracked. "She will not destroy me." Yet the more he raged, the smaller he seemed. Elena, seated firmly in the witness chair, radiated a power far greater than his outbursts. She had endured his slap, his insults, his attempts to erase her. Now, every word she spoke added another stone to the wall closing in around him. And still, she hadn't revealed everything. The mini cliffhanger hung heavy in the room. If this is just the beginning of her testimony, what devastating proof will she unveil next? Elena opened the final section of her folder, her fingers deliberate, her expression unyielding. The audience leaned forward, breaths held as though the very air depended on what she would reveal next. "This," she said, lifting a document sealed with the department's insignia, "is a classified memo written and signed by Secretary Harlow himself. It orders the concealment of civilian casualties during Operation Iron Shield." The word struck the room like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted. Soldiers in the gallery stiffened, and Judge McKenna's face hardened. Harlow lurched forward, shouting, "That is a forgery." His voice cracked, lacking the authority it once carried. His attorney clutched his arm, whispering furiously, but Harlow shoved him away. "She is lying. She's a traitor." His outburst only deepened the impression of guilt. Elena met his gaze with calm steel. "I was there, sir," she said softly, but with weight enough to silence the room. "I carried the bodies of those you tried to erase. Their silence will not protect you anymore." The prosecutor moved swiftly, handing copies of the memo to the judge and defense. Judge McKenna studied it, eyes narrowing. "This memo bears all the hallmarks of authenticity," he announced. Harlow's face drained of color, his arrogance collapsing under the weight of official recognition. Reporters scribbled frantically, some already typing headlines into hidden devices. Secretary ordered cover-up of civilian deaths. The narrative of the trial had shifted completely. This was no longer about accusations, but proof. Elena's testimony continued with chilling detail. She described nights when soldiers begged for reinforcements that never came, because funds were siphoned into secret deals. She recalled names, dates, and orders, each word a nail in the coffin of Harlow's career. "We weren't just abandoned," she said, voice trembling with memory. "We were sacrificed." Murmurs rippled through the gallery, some soldiers lowering their heads in shame, others glaring at Harlow with newfound hatred. His empire of fear was crumbling in real time. Desperate, Harlow lunged his feet again, pointing a trembling finger at Elena. "She's fabricating this entire story," he screamed. His voice no longer carried the tone of command, but of panic. "She's after revenge, nothing more." But even as he spat the words, the weight of evidence contradicted him. Judge McKenna thundered, "Sit down, Mr. Harlow. One more outburst, and I will remove you from this courtroom." The threat cut him down, leaving him trembling, powerless before the very court he thought he controlled. Elena leaned slightly forward, her tone steady but piercing. "You think this is revenge? No, this is justice. Justice for the soldiers who can't stand here today. Justice for the civilians who never had a voice." Her words hung heavy in the silence, more powerful than any gavel. Even those who doubted her at first felt the ground shift beneath them, as if history itself had turned against Harlow. He sank into his chair, his defiance evaporating, sweat beading on his forehead. The prosecutor closed the folder with finality. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. The witness has testified under oath and provided documentation verified by the court. The charges of corruption and abuse of power are no longer allegations. They are facts." Judge McKenna nodded gravely, his pen scratching as he recorded the moment. The courtroom erupted in whispers, the weight of a nation's trust teetering in the balance. Harlow's eyes darted wildly, searching for escape, but there was none. For Elena, the moment was not triumph but vindication. She had carried this burden for years, enduring fear, silence, and humiliation. Now, with the truth laid bare, she felt a surge of release. She had been struck in public, shame before all, but her calm persistence had delivered a blow far greater. And still, the question lingered in the room. What would become of Richard Harlow now that his empire of lies had collapsed? The courtroom was no longer his. Richard Harlow sat hunched. His once commanding shoulders slumped as whispers grew into a storm around him. The judge's gavel struck repeatedly, not just to restore order, but to seal the fate of a man who had thrived on intimidation. This court acknowledges the authenticity of the evidence presented. Judge McKenna declared, "The charges against Secretary Harlow are substantiated." The words landed like cannon fire. For the first time, Harlow didn't speak. He had no words left, no authority to wield. Reporters rushed toward the doors during recess, eager to broadcast the downfall of a man thought untouchable. Soldiers in the gallery rose slowly, some exchanging glances heavy with shame, others with relief. A colonel muttered, "It's over," while another whispered, "Finally." Elena remained in the witness seat, breathing deeply, her posture firm. She had endured humiliation, but she had not broken. She had turned pain into power. Her eyes scanned the room, meeting those of young recruits who now saw her as something more than a soldier. She was proof that truth could stand against tyranny. Harlow's attorney leaned in, voice low but sharp. "We can appeal," but Harlow cut him off with a hollow laugh. "Appeal? To whom? They've already decided." His gaze drifted toward Elena, seething with bitter disbelief. "You think this makes you powerful?" he muttered. Elena didn't answer. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. It was the silence of someone who no longer needed a fight, because she had already won. Judge McKenna called for order once more. "Captain Ramirez, you may step down." Elena stood slowly, each movement deliberate. The gallery's eyes followed her as though she carried the weight of every word she had spoken. As she walked back to her seat, the hush that fell over the room was reverent. No applause, no cheers, just a silence that acknowledged a shift in power. She was no longer the woman who had been struck in humiliation. She was a soldier who had struck back with truth. In the back row, a young cadet whispered, "She didn't just testify, she took command." The phrase spread like wildfire among the soldiers present, a quiet recognition of her symbolic victory. Harlow, by contrast, looked smaller than ever. His medals glinted under the lights, but they no longer carried meaning. They were relics pinned to a man exposed as a fraud. For years, he had commanded fear. Now, he commanded only pity, and even that was fleeting. The prosecutor gathered her files, satisfied but wary. She knew the road ahead would be long. Trials, investigations, dismantling the network Harlow had built. But today marked the turning point. Today, the fortress had cracked, and the world had seen it crumble. Elena's testimony had not just exposed one man. It had reminded everyone that no rank, no title, no authority was beyond accountability. The audience, once divided, now seemed united by a single truth. Justice had prevailed. As the gavel struck for adjournment, soldiers rose again, not for Harlow, but for Elena. Their eyes carried a silent salute, unspoken but unmistakable. She felt it, and for a moment her composure softened. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, not of triumph, but of relief. She had carried the truth alone for so long, and now the burden was shared. The humiliation she had suffered was no longer a scar. It was a spark that ignited change. Harlow was escorted out, flanked by guards. His steps dragged, the echo of his polished shoes now hollow. Reporters swarmed the hallways, their voices overlapping. Secretary of Defense toppled by soldiers' testimony. Elena lingered in the courtroom for a moment longer, taking in the emptying benches, the fading tension. She knew the fight for justice was far from over, but she had lit a flame that could not be extinguished. As she stepped outside, the sunlight hit her face, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She had not just survived, she had reshaped the battlefield. And though she had never sought glory, she had become a symbol of it. The world would remember that day not for the slap that began it, but for the truth that ended it. Mini cliffhanger for the audience. What other secrets might still lie hidden in the halls of power, waiting for someone brave enough to expose them? If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to light. For those who want to go further, consider joining our channel as a member. Together, we can keep exposing untold stories of courage and justice. More revelations like this are on the way. Don't miss the next one.